The rented wagon halted on the frozen ground with a low scrape, as if it too hesitated before the absolute stillness of a Wyoming winter. Evelynne Rhodes stepped down first, pulling her heavy coat close, her breath turning white in the biting air. In her trunk, vials and a small geology hammer clinked softly, a familiar sound in a land entirely foreign to her. Before her, Ward Ranch rose like a forgotten prayer in the White Valley. The wooden house had a strong backbone, yet its boards were weathered by wind and time. No voices, no movement. Only a silent porch and a sky so wide it made one feel too small to belong here. The door opened while Evelynne was still studying the distant rock layers. A man stepped out, Hayden Ward, just as she had been told. He was tall, with the solid build of a pine that had stood under years of snow, his features shaped by sun, wind, and loss into something quiet and hard to read. His gray eyes swept from her luggage to her appearance, pausing as if unaccustomed to seeing a woman alone on this land. Behind him, a boy of about 5 lingered. Elias Ward's dark, cautious eyes peeked out like 2 small marks of ink. He clutched the hem of his father's coat, yet there was a spark of curiosity in his gaze that Evelynne felt an unexpected pull toward. Hayden spoke, his voice low, few-toned, hitting the wooden air like a steady knock. "Yes," she said. She had come to survey the northern rock formations. He nodded once, then reached down to lift the heaviest equipment case, the one she had steeled herself to carry alone. When his rough hand brushed hers on the handle, a cold shiver ran through her, breaking into warmth just as quickly, halting her for a breath. A first touch. Brief, but carrying the weight of unfamiliar ground. He lifted the entire load with an ease she usually needed both hands for. "Let me," he said, plain and without flourish, simply a man accustomed to shouldering what needed to be done. The house behind him was neat to the point of severity, and Evelynne sensed at once. No woman's touch softened this place. The smell of wood, the aired-out clothing, everything in its place yet missing the warmth that made a dwelling feel lived in rather than endured. A strange wind rose. Evelynne looked up. The pale sky had shifted to a dull gray with alarming speed. Her Eastern experience gave her no instinct for danger, but Hayden's did. "A storm's coming," he said. "You need to get inside." "Just a moment," she began, reaching for another case. The words had barely formed when a hard gust tore through the valley. Snow spiraled like 100 white hands sweeping down. Evelynne blinked once and the world blurred. Her sample box nearly slipped. Instinct made her crouch to save it. But the wind struck harder, sharp against her skin. Hayden cursed under his breath, the sound almost a shout against the gale. "Leave it. Now." "But my instruments," she protested. "You won't find the house again if you stay out another minute." His hand closed around her wrist just as another burst of wind hit, so fierce her footing gave way. A second touch, urgent, instinctive, leaving no room to refuse. He pulled her close to shield her from the gusts. His body was hard as stone, yet warm enough for her to feel life amid the white force trying to swallow everything. They nearly fought their way to the porch, each step pushed against an invisible wall. Snow stung her eyes. For the first time in her research journeys, Evelynne felt fear, not of nature itself, but of her own confidence in a land she did not know. When the door shut behind them, she stood catching her breath, her coat and hair heavy with snow. Hayden released her wrist slowly, as if ensuring she could stand. Elias stared at her, wide-eyed. the reflection of fear and a hint of awe flickering in them. Evelynne brushed the snow from her coat and admitted what she had not wanted to face. She had misjudged this land and the man standing before her. The storm roared outside, and in the wooden house 3 people stood quietly learning how to exist in one another's lives without yet knowing it. Once the door closed, the storm's roar vanished as if swallowed by the white void outside. Inside the wooden house, silence filled the room quickly, rising like water in an empty basin. Evelynne stood on the rug, brushing the last bits of snow from her sleeves, realizing this silence did not belong to nature, but to a household missing the soft presence of a woman. The space was tidy, disciplined, arranged with such precision, it felt as though everything had been placed to keep memories from slipping out. A few items hung on the wall, each holding a thin coat of dust like a whisper of time. The faint smell of burned pine lingered, forming a muted heaviness, as if the room guarded a long-kept secret. Evelynne's gaze stopped at the rocking chair near the hearth, finely carved, lightly coated in dust. No one had sat in it for a long while. No one dared. No one wished to disturb the trace of the one who had sat there. The chair was not only empty, it was in mourning. She did not touch it, but the sight alone tightened something in her chest. Absence had shape, and that shape stood clear before her. She turned and caught Elias watching. The boy stood a few steps away, arms folded as if by habit, guarding himself. His round, dark eyes held fear and expectation both. There was something in them that echoed the rocking chair, waiting for someone who would never return. "Hello," Evelynne said softly, lowering her voice so he would not startle. Elias did not answer. He stepped a bit farther behind Hayden, yet his gaze did not leave her, studying whether she was danger or some strange, small wonder. Hayden removed his coat, a few melting flakes dropping to the floor. "Mrs. Rhodes, you can leave your things here. This storm won't break for a while." The way he used Mrs. Rhodes placed distance between them, but his eyes were not entirely cold. There was a quiet measure in them, as if he were trying to read what her arrival carried into his life. Evelynne set down her bags, trying to stand somewhere that would not be in anyone's way. But the house was so accustomed to 2 people, 1 man, 1 child, that her presence felt like a misplaced color, unsure where it belonged. She removed her gloves and stepped toward the kitchen, where the warmth of old ashes lingered. A pot of water sat near the stove, yet she did not know how to manage the vent or feed the fire with large logs, skills she had never needed in the East. She hesitated, then let her hands fall, unwilling to disrupt anything. Elias tilted his head to watch. Hayden stood a few steps behind her, silent, yet his look alone made her aware her hands did not quite fit this space. Can I help with anything?" she asked, her voice shrinking. Hayden held her in his gaze a moment longer than necessary. "No. You're a guest. Rest." She heard the caution of a man who had lost too much to trust easily, but she also heard the courtesy of someone who would not burden another. Evelynne moved to the window. Outside, the storm had erased every outline of the valley. The house seemed to float in the blankness. She knew her equipment, compass, notes, sample box, lay somewhere out there, beyond reach until the snow buried it for good. A small, quiet ache settled in her, not because her work was halted, but because, for the first time, she had been placed in a situation she could not command. Elias stepped a little closer, then stopped, like a fledgling testing the edge of its nest. "It's all right," she said gently, offering a small smile. I'm just not used to things yet. His eyes softened slightly, sensing she, too, was searching for a place within this house, the way he had been trying every day since losing his mother. Hayden stood by the hearth, adding another log. The fire rose, its light catching the worn planes of his face. He glanced at Evelynne, only half a heartbeat, but enough to show he was keeping track of her safety in the storm. The room grew warmer, yet the emptiness remained. Evelynne felt it like the snow outside, thick, white, heavy, settling over everything that had once been alive. And in that stillness, she understood something. It was not only the storm burying her instruments out there. It was pressing against the loneliness in this home, and in herself as well. Afternoon passed under the rumble of the storm, a sound like the long breath of the mountains. The ward house held its usual quiet, yet it was no longer as still as when Evelynne first entered. Something softer lingered in the air, as if her presence had stirred the thin dust of old sorrow. She sat on the rug near the hearth and opened the brown leather box that held the few rock samples she had managed to keep, the only things the blizzard had not taken. The faint click of the hinge was barely a sound, yet Elias's eyes turned toward it at once. He stood a few steps away, his small feet hesitant, but his gaze brightened like a spark catching flame. For the first time since her arrival, his eyes held something other than fear or caution. They held curiosity. Elias, Evelynne said gently, surprised by the softness in her own voice. Would you like to see something? He did not answer, but after a pause, his feet shifted. One step, then another. Each move seemed a test of whether the ground could be trusted. When he reached her, he stopped just within reach, his dark eyes wide, waiting. Evelynne lifted a piece of sedimentary rock, its fossil lines glinting in the firelight. This is a trilobite fossil, she whispered. It lived long before any of us. Elias's lips parted in a small circle. He looked at her, then at the fossil, as if trying to grasp with his eyes something too vast for a young heart to hold. Would you like to hold it? Before she finished, his hand rose, then hesitated, afraid he had been too bold. She smiled and placed the fossil in his palm. His fingers closed around it, trembling faintly, not from cold, but from feeling. When he looked up at her, his first smile formed, slow, shy, but real. The moment caught her off guard and softened her completely. He studied the fossil as if it were treasure, and without thinking, brushed against her hand, a touch light as breath, yet warm enough to steal hers for an instant. She did not pull away. Elias did not release her right away either. Across the room, Hayden stood half in firelight, half in shadow. He had planned to sharpen a small knife, but the blade froze in his hands when he saw Elias smile. The crease in his brow eased, followed by something he could not hide. Surprise, relief, and an old wound stirred by accident. For 2 years, Elias had not smiled like that. For 2 years, the house had known only the wind at the door, the winter-tightened wood, and the quiet breaths Hayden swallowed down. Yet now, a stranger from a far place had kindled his son's face like a young shoot finding sun in winter. Hayden's chest tightened, not with pain, but with something he did not dare name. Evelynne sensed someone watching. When she looked up, her eyes met his. Firelight moved in his gray eyes, giving them the depth of a lake before a storm. Neither spoke. Yet something shifted between them in that quiet. Elias lifted the fossil close to his face as if listening for its story. He smiled, again, bolder this time. Then he leaned lightly against Evelynne, the instinctive gesture of a child who feels safe. A chunk of snow broke on the roof, the sharp sound bringing all three back to the moment. Outside, the storm tore across the valley. The wind howled like a trapped beast, rattling the wooden walls, but inside another warmth was growing, small, steady. Evelynne looked from the fossil to Hayden. She did not know how long the storm would last, but she knew one thing with certainty. Not every storm destroys. Some carry people to the place they were meant to stand. The night storm rose stronger. Wind struck the wooden walls like unseen hands, and the hearth at the center of the room became the only heart holding warmth in the house. After a simple supper, the awkward soup Hayden cooked, but Elias ate gladly, Evelynne pulled a blanket around the sleepy boy. The house grew quieter, the firelight dancing across the bare walls. Hayden washed the dishes in silence for a long while, then moved toward the hearth where Evelynne sat with Elias leaning against her arm, his eyelids heavy. He pulled a wooden chair closer. Its soft scrape broke the distance without startling the boy. "He likes you," Hayden said, his voice low, faint as dying embers. "I haven't seen him like this in a long time." Evelynne brushed Elias's soft hair. Children sense safety before they understand anything else. He must have missed that. Hayden said nothing, his gaze falling to the small sparks snapping in the fire. After a moment he spoke, his voice more to himself than to her. "Catherine, my wife, died after he was born." Evelynne did not answer at once. "Some griefs are meant to be heard in quiet." Hayden continued, steady yet strained at the end of each sentence. "She was weak already. The doctor said we had to risk everything if we wanted to keep Elias. And we only kept one." The fire flared, lighting the worn shadows under his eyes. It was not the wear of a man who slept too little, but of one who carried too much, too long. "I had just lost her," Hayden said softly, "and I was holding a child I didn't know how to raise. I thought I would break." Evelynne studied him. Beneath the weathered strength of his face, she saw something few would notice: the resilience of a man who had stayed standing while storms tore at him. "You did better than you think," she said. "Elias feels safe. That doesn't happen by chance." Hayden looked at her for the first time without any guard. "And you, Evelynne? Coming alone all the way to Wyoming. You must carry something, too." She smiled faintly, but not with happiness. "The world of science isn't made for someone like me. A black woman who talks too much about things they say aren't fit for ladies. Rocks, time, the making of the earth." She tightened her free hand. "I was always expected to be smaller, softer, less opinion, less resolve, less capable. Sometimes I thought if I spoke quieter, if I shrank myself to fit their mold, maybe they would accept me." Hayden lifted his head, long enough that she had to glance away. "You don't need to be smaller," he said. "Not here." The words were simple, but they settled into her like warmth seeping through fabric to skin. A gust slid through the window frame, making her shiver. Before she could hide it, Hayden rose. He stepped close, very close, and without thinking drew her scarf back into place, slow and careful, his touch so gentle her heart tightened. The space between them was no more than a breath. His eyes met hers, honest, unguarded, asking nothing. He only wanted to be sure she was warm. And it was that simplicity that unsettled her most. Elias shifted, pressing his head to her chest. He slept fully now, One arm curled around her waist, as if he had long been used to holding someone that way, and had just remembered how. Evelynne looked down at the small child resting against her. A quiet breath left her, not from weariness, but from understanding. She was giving a piece of her heart to these two, though she had only just met them. Hayden sat again, watching without a word. But something old lived in his eyes, something he had buried the day Catherine died. Hope. Outside, the storm roared as if to drown the valley. But inside, a family, barely formed yet unmistakable, sat gathered together, warmer than any fire could make them. Evelynne touched Elias's hair, then lifted her gaze to Hayden. And in that moment, she knew. Some conversations change us, and some small touches, barely noticed, can alter the course of a life. The blizzard dragged into its third day, then the fourth, showing no sign of easing. Outside the windows, the world held only one color, white without horizon, without boundary. But inside the ward house, something else was happening, a warmth this place had not known in a long time. In the morning, while Hayden split wood behind the house, Evelynne spread the remaining rock samples across the table. Elias stood beside her, eyes bright, his small hands twisting with excitement. "This is sandstone," she said, tracing faint lines that looked like fingerprints of time. "And this is a fossil impression hundreds of millions of years old." Elias leaned closer, his elbow brushing her arm. He startled and tried to pull back, but Evelynne smiled, steadying him. He bent again, this time without retreating. "Evie, what is this one?" called. Evelynne's breath caught. Evie. The word fell from Elias as naturally as breathing. She had never told him to call her that, yet hearing it, soft, sweet, instinctive, sent a warmth through her chest she could not name. At the back door, Hayden stepped inside and heard it too. He stopped on the threshold, arms full of firewood. Not anger, not displeasure, just a brief stillness, like an unseen string pulled tight. He was used to hearing only one name from the boy, Papa. Now Elias had spoken another, and it belonged to the woman who had entered their home like a small, warm flame. Something flickered in Hayden's eyes. Not possessiveness, fear of losing something he had only just begun to feel again. But Evelynne didn't notice. She was watching Elias smile, a smile that softened every shadow in the room. She showed him how to read rock layers, how to tell the older strata by their color. She had never spoken so much to a child, and never had anyone listened to her with such wholehearted wonder. Elias talked more than he had in months, words tumbling out with bright breath, as if the frost of the past 2 years inside him had cracked open. "Evie, is this an animal?" "Yes. It's the trace of a creature from the sea floor." "Sea?" His eyes widened. "Wyoming has a sea?" Evelynne laughed. "Long ago, this land was the bottom of an ocean." Elias gasped, then burst into a clear, ringing laugh. Hayden, standing by the hearth, bowed his head, hiding the ache that rose in his chest. That sight, this black woman with gentle eyes, pointing at a fossil, the boy leaning against her like a leaf seeking sun, the sound of laughter rippling through the wooden house, brought a life he had believed gone forever. "My boy's troubling you too much," Hayden said, as Evelynne washed her hands. "Not at all," she answered. I need this more than I knew." They did not lift their heads, yet somehow their eyes met in the window's reflection. Slow, steady, holding more than either dared name. That afternoon, when Evelynne bent to pick up a sample Elias dropped, Hayden reached at the same moment. Their fingers brushed, light, fleeting, but enough to halt her breath. Hayden withdrew his hand carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile. Evelynne stepped back, but her heart moved forward in a way she could no longer control. At midday, Elias climbed into her lap without warning, as if that place had always been his refuge. He rested his head on her chest, whispering, "Evie, can we learn more tomorrow?" "Yes, tomorrow." Hayden heard every word. He stood behind the table, his hand tightening on the edge until his knuckles whitened, not from anger, but from the trembling of a heart returning to life. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside this small house the snow began to melt, not on the roof but in the hearts of 3 people held together by a fate long in the making. Evelynne looked at Elias, then at Hayden, and for the first time she admitted it. She was no longer just a guest in this home. The 5th night of the storm swept into the valley, like a great beast that had held itself back too long and now roared without restraint. The ward house trembled under each gust, snow striking the windows like fists clinging to life. Evelynne closed her notebook, but her hands shook, not from cold, though the wind groaned outside, but from the unease it carried. Elias had fallen asleep in his small room at the end of the hall. Only after insisting she tell one more story about ancient sea stones. She sat by the hearth, a blanket loose around her shoulders, the fire casting her shadow on the wall like a fragile drawing against the storm. When the wind rose again, she tightened the blanket. At that moment, Hayden appeared in the doorway, not rushing, but filling the space with the quiet steadiness of the house itself. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, softened by concern he did not try to hide. "I just isn't what I'm used to," she said. "Storms back east aren't like this." Hayden stepped closer and sat beside her, near enough that his warmth shifted the air. He drew part of her blanket toward him, sharing it, setting half across her shoulders. A simple gesture. Yet to Evelynne, it felt like lighting a lamp in a dim room. "Storms pass," Hayden murmured, eyes on the flames. "People sometimes don't get past the things that frighten them." Evelynne turned toward him. The firelight caught the line of his cheek, making him look carved from old pine. "You're talking about yourself," she whispered. Hayden exhaled, the sound long, as if carried through far more winters than this one. "I didn't think I'd survive losing Catherine." Some nights Elias cried until he had no voice left, and I didn't know how to comfort him, didn't know how to be a father at all. His voice thinned at the edges. Evelynne wanted to place her hand on his, but she waited. Some griefs must be opened by the one who carries them. "There were nights," Hayden went on, "when I stayed awake beside his bed, afraid he'd leave me too. Just vanish like she did." Evelynne saw his fist tighten, the fear still living there beneath the weathered skin. "You didn't lose him," she said gently. "You kept him. You raised him the only way you knew. That is enough." Hayden lifted his gaze to hers. The moment lingered until even the wind outside seemed to fade. "And you?" he asked. "What did you carry so far to get here?" Evelynne watched the fire, listening to the wood crackle like faint whispers. "I left home because the world kept asking me to be smaller. I love science, I love thinking big and speaking big, but they told me I was too much, too loud. too knowing for a woman. Hayden frowned, not in disbelief but in quiet anger on her behalf. "You're not too much," he said, each word slow and sure. "You are exactly as you should be." The words did not feel like comfort. They felt like being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. A heavy thud hit the roof, and Evelynne flinched. Instinct carried her toward Hayden. His arm came around her in the same breath, shielding her from the storm as he had since the first day. But now the embrace held something different. No hesitation. No distance. "You're safe," Hayden said, his voice close to her ear. The quiet between them changed. No longer tense or unsure, but a thread binding two people who once thought they would walk the rest of their lives alone. Evelynne rested her head on his shoulder. After a brief pause, his arm folded fully around her, holding her with a care that spoke of loss and of something new taking root. They stayed like that, breath easing together, warm, slow, steady in a way only two hearts once broken could understand. They did not kiss. They did not rush. There was no need to fill the silence. When Evelynne finally lifted her face, Hayden's eyes had softened in a way that made the world outside fall away. And when he set his forehead against hers, only the lightest touch. She knew the line between them had vanished in quiet. That night, with the storm raging outside, they found each other through small touches, shared breath, and the steady beats of their own hearts. Not to cover their loneliness, but to acknowledge they had found belonging in one another. At dawn, the wind had eased. Snow still covered the world, but something warmer lived in her chest, solid and calm, like the first light after a storm. She looked toward Hayden, still asleep, one hand resting lightly on the blanket between them, as if to make sure she had not slipped away. And Evelynne realized she had entered this house as a stranger, yet woke as if she had always belonged here. The next morning, the Wyoming sky was startlingly clear. After days of the blizzard's fury, the stillness of dawn felt like the land itself had taken a long breath. Snow lay knee-deep, white and flawless, giving no hint of the storm that had carved it. Evelynne stood by the window, the curtain brushing her arm. The first light touched the smooth snow, turning the valley into a sheet of silver. Peaceful, beautiful, and quietly cruel. Cruel because it reminded her the road would soon open, and her life, the one led by research schedules and scientific reports, was still waiting. For a moment she pressed a hand to her chest, where the warmth of last night remained, the night she and Hayden let their loneliness find each other. She wanted to hold that feeling, but reason, her longtime companion, stirred awake. "I can't let the work drift off course," she told herself. "A few more days, and I'll return." The thought hurt more than she expected. Evelynne spread a sheet of paper on the kitchen table and began writing to the university. She explained the delay caused by the storm, that her research had been interrupted, that she would return to Boston as soon as the road cleared. She did not notice the sentence that cut deeper than any blade. "My time at Ward Ranch has been an unplanned disruption to the research schedule." Proper words, dry, rational, and entirely at odds with what she felt. Elias ran into the kitchen, cheeks flushed from playing on the porch. "Evie, are you writing something?" Evelynne smiled and ruffled his hair. "A letter to my school, that's all." "I can take it to Papa in the barn," he said, holding out his hand. She nodded. "Be careful." Elias hugged the letter and ran off, boots tapping on the wooden floor. Evelynne turned back to her samples, feeling an odd relief, as if writing the letter sought her hold on to a part of herself she feared losing. But a few minutes later, The air in the house shifted. Hayden stepped through the back door, snow on his coat, his face steady as stone. But his eyes were not the same. They were cold as the morning she first met him, cold as the days before Elias laughed again. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said, his voice flat, stripped of the softness of the past days. Evelynne froze. "You read the letter?" Hayden set the paper on the table, the fold lines sharp enough to sting. "I see this has all been a disruption to you, an accident along your research path." "No, that's not what I meant." "You don't need to explain," he said, cutting her off. His tone wasn't loud, but it closed like a winter door. "I understand." Something inside her dropped like a rope pulled too tight. Elias stood behind him, half hidden. He looked from one to the other, the dark, round eyes now dimmed by something he didn't yet have words for. He had seen that look only once before, when he learned his mother would not return. "Evie, are you leaving?" Elias asked, his voice small as wind. Evelynne knelt, reaching for him, but Elias stepped back, fists tight at his sides, as if touching her would break him further. "Papa said the road will open soon," he whispered. "Evie will go back to her place." Hayden placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, never looking at her. "Elias, go see if the chickens ate. Let the adults talk." The boy nodded but kept his eyes on Evelynne until the door closed behind him. When only the two of them remained, the distance between them thickened like smoke. "Hayden, that letter, it isn't what I feel. It's just how I must write to the university. It's clear enough," he said. "You have your life, your work. I don't blame you for that." The words, "I don't blame you," weighed heavier than any accusation. Then he turned, climbing the stairs to his room, each step slow yet certain, the steps of a man rebuilding a wall that had fallen only hours earlier. Evelynne stood there, her hand gripping the edge of the table. The warmth of the past days faded, replaced by the familiar cold of lives that had lost too much. Elias did not run to her. Hayden did not look back. And Evelynne understood, in a breath that hurt. Clear skies do not always mean calm. Sometimes they shine bright enough to reveal what one wished not to see. From that morning on, the ward house, once warmed by Elias's soft laughter and the unspoken closeness between two adults, slowly returned to its old shape, still, orderly, and full of untouched spaces no one dared cross. Evelynne sensed it immediately, not through words, but through the absence of them. When she came to the kitchen, Hayden was making breakfast, but instead of turning with a small nod as he had before, he spoke only one line, his voice steady yet sharp as winter ice. "Good morning, Miss Rhodes." The words struck her straight in the chest. Not Evelynne, not the long looks across the fire the night before, not the warmth shared as if the world had narrowed to only the two of them. Just Miss Rhodes, cold, polite, distant. She answered with a faint, "Good morning," barely more than a lost breeze. But Hayden did not lift his eyes. He kept them on the pan, movements precise, as though afraid that one glance at her would reveal something he was no longer allowing himself to feel. Elias sat at the table, legs swinging without purpose. He didn't smile. He didn't chatter about lessons. He stared at his plate, poking his bread as if it were a task too heavy for him. "Elias, do you want to keep learning about sandstone layers?" Evelynne asked softly. He didn't look up. No. One word. Short. Cold. But it wasn't anger. It was sorrow. Quiet, bewildered sorrow from a small heart that could not understand why the warmth of the past days had vanished. Hayden glanced at his son, then at Evelynne. The look didn't blame her, yet it didn't reach for her either. He stood between them but belonged to neither side. He had rebuilt the boundary she thought had fallen. She held her breath steady. "That's all right, Elias. Whenever you want, I'll be here." But she knew he didn't believe it. And strangely, she wasn't sure she did either. The days that followed felt longer than the blizzard. Elias grew silent, so quiet he no longer resembled the child who laughed when she spoke of ancient seas. Sometimes he watched her from across the room, hope flickering in his eyes, but when she smiled, he looked away quickly, as if caught in something he feared would hurt. Hayden avoided her more each day. Not harsh, not cruel, just withdrawn into the careful distance he believed proper between a widower and the woman who would soon leave. Once she passed the table and their hands brushed while reaching for the same cup. Before, such touches sent a soft tremor through her. Now Hayden pulled away instantly, as if she were something too hot to handle. She withdrew into her own quiet. On the fourth afternoon after the storm broke, Evelynne sat in the sewing room, the room that once belonged to Catherine. The half-finished quilt lay untouched in the corner, its halted stitches like the unfinished life of the woman who had left it behind. Wind murmured through the window frame like a faint whisper. Evelynne wrapped a blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt did not come from outside. It came from the small breaks inside her, each one made whenever Hayden called her by that distant name, from the sadness in Elias's eyes, from realizing she had damaged something precious in their lives, and in her own. She pulled her knees close and stared out at the frost-blurred glass. Outside, the white field looked like a vast mourning cloth. Inside this room, she felt pushed out of an embrace she hadn't known she'd stepped into until it was gone. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hall, maybe Elias slipping into his room, or Hayden closing the barn door. But no one came in. No one looked for her. No one asked if she was all right. And that silence hurt more than any storm. Evelynne laid her hand on Catherine's sewing chair, brushing the worn fabric. She whispered, unsure if she spoke to herself or to the woman long gone. "I shouldn't have let myself belong here." But her heart, stubborn in its own way, whispered back, "You already do." That afternoon, the wind had settled, yet inside the ward house another storm gathered, quieter and far more dangerous than any snow outside. Evelynne was folding her sample boxes, telling herself she was only preparing ahead, though each time the lid closed, something in her chest tightened with it. Small footsteps paused at her doorway. Slow, light, then still. "Evie?" The call was fragile, like a hand afraid of being pushed away. Evelynne looked up. Elias stood on the threshold, gripping a neatly folded sheet of paper. He didn't step inside. He only watched her, dark eyes wide and shining, as if she were the last thing that could steady something breaking inside him. "Elias? Come in, sweetheart." He came forward one tiny step at a time, as though walking across a frozen lake. He held out the paper, his hands trembling. I drew this for Evie." Evelynne opened it. A house. 3 figures. Hayden tall, Elias small beside him, and an empty outlined space faint from being drawn and erased again and again. Above it, in uneven letters, "Evie stays here." The blow landed before she could brace for it. She had to set a hand on the table to keep herself steady. Elias swallowed. His eyes shone. His voice barely a thread. "Evie, why won't you stay? Is it because you don't like me? Or you don't like Papa?" The words tore her heart without mercy. "No, sweetheart, no." "Then why are you going?" His lip trembled until it bled. "Papa said Evie has another place to go. A place better than here." Evelynne felt her vision blur. She knelt, reaching for him, but Elias stepped back, hurt and frightened both. "If you don't like it here, you can say so. I won't bother you. I'll be good." His small voice cracked like old wood under snow. Evelynne broke. Tears came fast, unstoppable. "Elias, you did nothing wrong. Not one thing." She gathered him into her arms. For the first time, he didn't rush forward. He stood stiff a moment, needing proof that the love he hoped for had not vanished. Then he collapsed. He sobbed into her neck, clutching her with desperate strength, as though she were the last anchor holding his world together. "I don't want you to go. I don't want anyone to go." Those words were not a child's simple cry. They were 2 years of loss. The voice of a boy who had watched his world disappear one morning and had never found the bottom of that grief. Hayden heard the crying from the barn. He dropped what he was doing and rushed toward the house, but halted when he reached her door. Elias's sobs seeped through the crack, each one tightening something inside him until his breath caught. He braced a hand against the frame, knuckles whitening. Every broken plea, "Evie, don't go," struck a place he thought had grown numb. He wanted to walk in, to lift his boy, to promise him the world would hold steady. But he didn't believe that promise himself. He turned away, unable to face the pain he had helped cause. In the barn, the familiar scent of hay and warm horses wrapped around him. He sank onto the old wooden stool, elbows on his knees, head bowed. Elias had only just begun to smile again after 2 long years, and Hayden had been the one to steal it back. Through one misunderstanding, one fear of abandonment he had never learned to tame. A moment later, Elias ran to find him. He threw himself into Hayden's arms, sobbing hard. Hayden held him tight, his large hand cradling the boy's head, as though shielding him from the whole world. "Papa, is Evie really going? If she goes, will she come back?" Hayden closed his eyes. His hand shook. He wanted to soothe the boy with a lie, but he had lived long enough to know that the gentlest promises can be the cruelest when broken. "Papa doesn't know, son." Elias cried harder, small, helpless, pouring out everything he had held inside. And in the sewing room, Evelynne clutched her knees, hearing that cry echo through the walls, the sound of a heart breaking, and her own breaking with it. She understood then, with a clarity she could not run from. If she left this house, it would not be only Hayden and Elias who lost something. She would lose part of herself, part she had given to them without even knowing when. Christmas morning rose in a strange kind of light, pale, clear, and cold. Like a farewell, no one spoke, yet everyone could hear. Fresh snow had laid a thin sheet over the fields, making the world look like a blank page folded before anything could be written on it. Evelynne sat on the edge of the sewing room bed, hands on her suitcase, unable to fasten the strap. It was a simple motion, just a pull. Yet her fingers trembled, as though every muscle resisted the decision she had lived by all her life. To return to duty, reason, the path of a scientist who was never allowed to stop. A soft knock came at the door. "Evie, can I come in?" She opened it. Elias stood there with both hands clasped around three small objects wrapped in old newspaper. He held them out silently, afraid his voice would break into sobs if he spoke. "For Evie," he managed, though it was barely a breath. Evelynne knelt. She unwrapped the gifts one by one. The first was the drawing he had mended. Now 4 figures stood together. Hayden tall, Elias small beside him, another figure of the boy himself, and a clear, unerased shape at their side. Her. The little hand in the drawing held hers openly. The second was a small stone, not a fossil, just an ordinary piece he had picked up outside. He had tied a bit of string around it, as though it were precious. "To help Evie remember Wyoming," he whispered. The third struck deepest, a round slice of firewood he had cut, with her name carved crookedly into it. Evie. Evelynne pressed a hand to her mouth to stop the sound rising in her throat. Elias watched her, eyes red and wet, voice soft as snow falling on ice. "I made them for Evie, so Evie knows this is home too." There was no craft in his words, no metaphor, no attempt to be poetic, only the bare truth of a child who had lost too much too young. She gathered him into her arms. This time he didn't pull away. His arms wrapped tight around her neck, his small body curling into hers as if shrinking down to the size of a single breath. "Evie, don't go," he whispered into her hair. I'll be better, I promise." She couldn't answer. All she could do was hold him closer, as though she might keep something from slipping away. Hayden had readied the wagon early. He didn't knock to call her as he once had. He stood alone in the yard, hand on the reins, back straight, eyes fixed on the road emerging from the last of the storm. The way he stood told her everything. He had buried his hurt beneath the stance of a man who refused to let his grief spill out again. When she stepped onto the porch, suitcase trembling in her grasp, Elias followed, clutching the last of his gifts. The 3 of them paused, just 3 breaths, yet long as 3 winters. Hayden looked at her, not avoiding, but not approaching either. "The road's clear," he said, his voice flat, stripped of the warmth it once carried. "I'll take you to the crossroads. You can catch the stage into town from there." "Thank you," she replied, her voice hollow, as though the cold wind had torn half of it away. Elias gripped her sleeve, his small fingers trembling. "Evie, if you go, will you come back?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came. Not because she didn't know the answer, because any answer would wound him deeper. Hayden touched the boy's shoulder. "Elias, let Miss Rhodes get ready." Miss Rhodes. A barrier rebuilt with 2 simple words. Elias pulled his hand away as though burned. He stepped back, then again, eyes locked on her face as if trying to memorize every line. Her hair, her coat, her breath. The house, once close and warm, seemed vast and cold now. Christmas should have held laughter, sweetbread, blessings. Here it held a man hiding the crack in his heart, a child gripping his last hope, and a woman standing between 2 lives, one built by reason, the other shaped by a family she had never dared hope to belong to. Hayden lifted the suitcase onto the wagon, each movement exact, almost severe. Evelynne tightened her scarf, as though it were the only thing keeping her tied to the warmth of the days behind her. No one spoke again. The sky was bright. The snow glimmered. Yet in the hearts of all three that Christmas carried no candles, only a silence sharp enough to break like ice, a silence that said what none of them dared admit. Some partings need no tears. Silence alone can turn a heart to snow. At midday on Christmas, the cold sunlight fell across the valley like shards of broken glass. The quiet was so complete that every step on the porch sounded like a countdown to an inevitable parting. Evelynne stepped outside, her suitcase heavier than ever, not from what it held, but from what pressed against her heart. Hayden had finished securing the reins and stood beside the wagon, his back straight in that way she knew he used to hold everything inside. Elias hovered near the doorway, his small hand clenched around the frame, his wide, hurting eyes fixed on her as if the world had begun to crack beneath him. A sharp wind swept around her boots, one last urging, "Go!" But as she placed her foot on the step, a small cry split the air without warning. "Evie!" Elias launched himself toward her like a lost arrow, tiny arms wrapping around her legs, face buried in her coat. He sobbed hard, sounds no longer shaped like cries, but like pieces of something shattering after days of trying to stay strong. "Evie, don't go." His voice broke apart. "You can't go. Don't leave me. I need you. Please." Evelynne froze. She knelt, her hands trembling as they touched his back. "Elias, sweetheart, But he lifted his face, tears streaming down cheeks reddened by fear and winter air. His voice was raw, barely breath. "I don't want to lose again. I don't want someone else to go away. Papa and me, we only have you." The plea, small, fragile, honest to the point of cruelty, struck straight through her. She pulled him into her arms. He clung to her like roots to soil, as if she were the one thing anchoring him against everything that could take him. Hayden stood a few steps away. He watched, his face unmoving, but his eyes burned with regret, helplessness, and a pain he had buried beneath a hard exterior. His hands locked together, knuckles white. "Elias," he tried, but the word caught. The boy couldn't hear him, or couldn't let himself hear. Elias's tears soaked into Evelynne's coat, hot as sparks against her chest. She cupped his cheek and forced herself to say the words she believed were right, though they felt more wrong than anything she had ever spoken. "Elias, I have to go," he cried out, a sound not loud, but sharp as a blade. "Don't!" Evelynne flinched. He had never raised his voice to her. Elias shook with the force of his fear. "Evie, I need you. I need you here. Papa needs you too. Don't leave." His words dissolved into quiet sobs, but he didn't loosen his grip. The air thickened until even breathing felt difficult. At last Hayden stepped forward. Snow on his boots crunched softly as he stopped beside them. He looked from the boy to Evelynne, no walls left in his expression, no distance to hide behind. In his eyes, she saw his fear, his instinct to shield, and something deeper, a longing he had not dared name. "Hayden," she whispered. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. He had to try twice before forcing the words out, slow, strained, heavy as stone. "Please." His voice barely held together, soft enough to vanish in the wind, yet trembling with truth. He swallowed, fighting for air. "Please, stay." Elias fell silent for a heartbeat, long enough for his eyes to widen at his father's voice, stunned by the words neither of them had dared speak. Evelynne felt her knees weaken. She looked up at Hayden and found, for the first time, no defenses. Only a man who had lost too much, now standing on the edge of losing more. The wind still howled outside, but on that porch a new stillness formed, the kind that comes when every choice becomes destiny. She looked at Elias clinging to her. She looked at Hayden trying not to fall apart in front of her. And in that moment, she understood. This was no longer about storms or work or scientific plans. It was about deciding where her heart belonged and to whom. Hayden never knew the exact moment Evelynne made her choice. Maybe it was Elias's broken sobs, as though his small heart were coming apart. Maybe it was the trembling words he himself had never believed he could say. Please stay. Or maybe it was all of it together. Another kind of storm. One not meant to destroy, but to clear a path. Evelynne rose. Her hand went to Elias first, smoothing his tear-tangled curls. Sweet boy, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Elias stopped crying at once, as if the words themselves steadied the ground beneath him. He clung to her again, but not to keep her from leaving, only to make sure she was truly staying. Evelynne lifted her gaze to Hayden. Work can wait, she said softly, soft enough to stop his heart for a beat. But love can't. Hayden closed his eyes for a breath, like a man pulled back from the edge. When he opened them, something warmer lived there, a light spreading slowly, like spring seeping into a land long familiar with winter. March came slowly, bringing the first hints of warmth after the long, dark season. Snow melted into small streams under the eaves, the earth softened, and the last scent of winter drifted off on the wind. Birds returned. Their calls woke the ranch. On a morning tender as mist, as the sun climbed over the ridge, Evelynne and Hayden stood on the porch, the same porch that had witnessed tears and unspoken pleas. There were no guests, no ceremony, only the three of them, Hayden, Evelynne, and Elias, who served as ring-bearer but refused to let go of her hand. Hayden looked at her with a shy gentleness rare for him. You're sure? Evelynne smiled, a smile holding both the storms and the sunlight. Never been more sure in my life. In the soft wind, a promise took shape, not written, not witnessed, but carried by a heart that finally felt full. Elias clapped first, leaping forward, arms around them both, shouting into the breeze, "Mama's staying home for good." For the first time, she heard that word directed at her, and her heart, once belonging to cold laboratories and conference halls, warmed in a way no science could name. Spring unfolded with quiet, steady change. The rocking chair in the parlor no longer gathered dust. It held someone each night, Evelynne, with Elias leaning against her, the two of them reading about fossils, strata, and ancient seas he believed were where Mama worked before she found her real home. Hayden often stood in the doorway watching them, then stepped forward to press a kiss to her hair before he added another log to the fire. The house, once a place that simply endured, became a home, not because of furniture or laughter alone, but because 3 breaths finally moved in rhythm. Evelynne continued her geological work, but it was no longer a chase for conferences or a fight fought to prove herself to people who refused to see her. She wrote her reports at a small table by the window overlooking the fields. Each afternoon, she took Elias with her to the southern ridge, teaching him to read rock the way one reads a page from time. Hayden walked behind them, saying little, Yet every glance they shared held a warmth like something long lost, being rewritten. One small gesture at a time. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Evelynne sat on the porch with Elias curled in her lap, his small hand in hers, as she taught him to sketch a new specimen. "Mama," Elias whispered, "is it true stones can remember old things?" "Yes," she said, resting her hand over his heart. "But people remember too." Hayden stepped onto the porch and sat beside them. No one spoke. No one needed to. In the quiet that settled around them, Evelynne thought of the blizzard, of the cold days when hearts nearly broke, of Elias clutching her leg in desperation, of Hayden's trembling, "Please, stay." And now, with both of them beside her, she understood. She had discovered something no map or research could uncover: a home, a heart, a family. She whispered, a gentle closing to a long journey. Some discoveries come from science, some come from the heart, and sometimes the heart is where we belong first. Hayden took her hand. Elias wrapped his arms around them both. Spring touched the ward roof like a blessing, and so the three who once met in a storm finally found their way home. If you've ever found a late-blooming home in your own life, or grieved something that almost slipped away, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if today's story brought you a bit of warmth in a quiet afternoon, please like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapters. This channel is honored to walk beside you, kind, seasoned hearts who know the weight and beauty of love.